As 1944 drew to a close, the bitter cold of December wrapped Western Europe in frost and fire. The Allies had just repelled Hitler's desperate Ardennes offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. But Germany was not done yet. One final, audacious move remained, not on the ground, but in the skies. It was called Operation Bodenplatte, massive surprise airstrike intended to shatter Allied air power in one stroke. For the American 48th Fighter Group stationed in Belgium, January 1st, 1945 would become one of the most unforgettable days of the war, a morning of destruction, chaos, and immense loss. This is the story of that day, told by those who lived it. On New Year's Eve, Lieutenant Ed Catrell and the rest of the 48th Fighter Group were stationed at St. Trond airfield in Belgium. Still recovering from recent missions, they had no warning of what was about to come. "We didn't know what was going to happen," Catrell later recalled. "We knew the Germans had been pushed back, but nothing more." That same night, just across enemy lines, German pilots were being briefed on what would be one of the Luftwaffe's most ambitious and ultimately disastrous air operations of the war. Codenamed Bodenplatte baseplate, the plan was deceptively simple. Cripple Allied air operations by launching a massive, low-level surprise attack against airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France. The Luftwaffe hoped to destroy hundreds of parked aircraft, airstrips, and support infrastructure in one swift blow, an effort to regain air superiority in the West. But there was a fatal flaw: lack of experience. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was caught in a deadly cycle. As combat losses increased, pressure grew to churn out new pilots more rapidly. The result? Undertrained men with only a handful of flying hours being thrust into complex and high-risk missions like Bodenplatte. Many of the young German pilots were unprepared for combat, let alone a daring, coordinated, low-level assault. In the early hours of January 1st, 1945, German fighters took off under the cover of morning fog. One such unit, JG-4, led by Oberleutnant Lothar Wolff, followed a Junkers Ju-88 guide plane to navigate the route. But poor planning soon led to disaster. Many German aircraft mistakenly flew over their own anti-aircraft defenses and were fired upon. Nearly a quarter of the Luftwaffe's losses that day came from friendly fire, even before they reached their targets. JG-4 avoided that fate and pressed on. Their intended target was the airfield at Liège. But confusion in navigation exacerbated by the loss of their lead aircraft led them off course. Instead, they descended on St. Trond, the airfield where Lieutenant Ed Catrell and the 48th were stationed. At around 9:30 a.m., while many American pilots were preparing for a scheduled mission, what appeared to be British Spitfires came screaming in at treetop level. But these were no allies. They were Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, and they were armed and ready to kill. Lieutenant Ed Catrell was on runway alert, engines running in his P-47 Thunderbolt. But there was no time to take off. After the first pass, we were out of the cockpit, he recalled. They would have got us before we ever got off the ground. Catrell and his comrades dove for cover in ditches at the runway's edge. Captain Lloyd White, another pilot on the runway, also abandoned his aircraft moments before the German planes strafed it with gunfire and bombs. Several ground crew members, thinking the aircraft were British, realized the truth only when one of the planes banked to avoid a tree revealing its distinctive German markings. The initial wave of the German assault hit hard. According to the 493rd Squadron report, we were peacefully minding our own business when a squadron of so-called Spitfires suddenly appeared and started strafing us. Never had a foxhole seemed more inviting. But American anti-aircraft gunners quickly responded. Despite the element of surprise, many German pilots made grave errors, failing to drop external fuel tanks, flying too high or too slowly, or simply missing targets due to poor aim. These were telltale signs of inexperience, and the Luftwaffe paid dearly for it. One German FW-190, piloted by Oberfähnrich Hans Pazel, was hit mid-attack and burst into flames. Lieutenant Warren Sensen witnessed the moment. He did the most beautiful pull-up, half-roll, and drop-out. He came floating down, Pazel crash-landed nearby, and was captured after lighting a pipe while awaiting American troops. But not all were so lucky. Another German Pilota teenage Bf-109 aviator was less fortunate. As his plane came in low during a strafing run, American gunners struck him. The aircraft crashed just 50 feet from Lieutenant Catrell's position. When he and others reached the wreck, they found the boy already dead, shot through the forehead. Catrell later reflected, shaken. He couldn't have been more than 17. They didn't drop their belly tanks. You don't strafe with full belly tanks, that's suicide. This anonymous young pilot likely represented the worst consequences of the Luftwaffe's dwindling resources. Boys, not men, sent to die in battles they were never prepared to fight. By the end of the assault on St. Trond, 14 of the 16 aircraft from JG-4 were either shot down or crash-landed. Only 2 survived. Lieutenant Joseph Kunz crash-landed en route back to base. The sole pilot to return safely was Lothar Wolf, who flew alone back to base through the Rhine Valley. Upon arrival, he reported to his commander, who was shocked at the near-total loss and ordered the mission be repeated the next day. Wolf and the other survivors were stunned. "What kind of leadership is this?" he asked years later. The whole thing was madness. Operation Bodenplatte did succeed in destroying over 200 Allied aircraft across Europe, but the cost was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 143 pilots killed or missing, and 70 more captured, losses it could no longer afford. Unlike aircraft, which could be rebuilt, these trained aviators were irreplaceable. From that day forward, German air power was a shadow of what it once had been. Years later, Ed Catrell would return to St. Trond. The runway was still there, scarred but standing. The ditch he dove into for cover remained visible, and on the tarmac, you could still see the stains where planes had once burned. Ed also visited the crash site of his roommate, Lieutenant Ted Smith, killed later that same day. Locals gave him a piece of Smith's compass, matching the serial number on his aircraft. "It was Ted's plane," Ed said, voice wavering with emotion. "They told me they would keep flowers on his grave every day." After January 1st, Lieutenant Ed Catrell continued flying missions over Europe. In March 1945, he received his own P-47, which he named Feet of Heaven after his newborn daughter. He flew it until the war's end. Now over 100 years old, Ed remains one of the few living pilots from that harrowing day. His story and the tragic tale of Bodenplatte remind us of the bravery, the sacrifice, and the human cost behind the headlines of war.